What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We have more exciting, special content coming your way this week as we are joined in the Red Library by some new comrades from CounterPower, Comrades Jaime and Padré, to talk about CounterPower's newly published book, Organizing for Autonomy, History, Theory, and Strategy for Collective Liberation. This is a fantastic discussion between the Red Troika and Comrades Padré and Jaime representing CounterPower on the role of theory for today's left, the place of history, what is to be done, and all sorts of excellent things regarding strategy, political organizing, interpersonal relations, blockages on the left, and all sorts of other good stuff. We're going to jump right in today, but as always, let's run down our standard logistics of how you can support Red Library if you're not already doing so, besides just listening every week. If you'd like to become a patron, head over to our Patreon. That is www.patreon.com/Red Library Podcast. For as little as $1 per month, that is less than a quarter an episode, you can get access to our exclusive Discord server, roundtable discussions, book groups, movie nights, a whole lot of wholesome discourse, a whole lot of daggers being sharpened, and some excellent shit posting along the way. We're working our way up to 250 patrons now, and we're getting close to being halfway. So again, if you like what we're doing and you want to support the show materially, as well as spiritually, head on over there. Drop us a buck or two. Remember, you can follow Red Library on Twitter, you can like us on Facebook, and if you're listening on iTunes, please go down, give us one of those star reviews, write us a line or two, help more potential comrade listeners all across the globe find the work that we are doing. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons Podcasting Network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our podrads over at the Regrettable Century, and from 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. I want to go ahead and give another big shout out to Comrades Padré and Jaime from CounterPower. This episode to me is a very special one as it really focuses on the work that we've been trying to do on Red Library in regards to theorizing, but doing it in dialogue and discussion with other comrades out there who are interested in doing the same thing. And so we think that this will hopefully model a way to have a useful and stimulating and engaging way to talk about theory and history and leftist organizing today. And we hope that you'll take something not just from the content itself, but also the form, also the process of us going through the dialogue itself. All right, y'all, enjoy this one. We'll see you back here afterward. Yo, gang. It's Red Library here. We got a full crew. We got the full Comrade Commissar gang, and we have some pretty awesome, amazing new comrades in the library to not read someone else's book, but to lead us through their book. So let's go around and I assume everyone knows who we are, but just for the formality of it, who we got from the Red Library crew?
This is CC Dunn. We also have a cat infiltrator. Yeah.
We have a very large cat who is also part of the Red Library gang.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Comrade Commissar Degeneracy, Alex here.
Yeah.
Feeling quite raw.
It's an early morning for
Yeah, I usually don't see this time of day. I usually don't wake up until about 3 p.m., so... Here I am. You're lucky I'm here. I will just put it that way.
That whole degeneracy title, he really lives up to the name. So this is, Comrade Adam / Chairman Bain / the people. Anyway, so this is the Red Library crew. But why don't you go ahead and introduce y'all? And if you want to talk about sort of individually introduce yourselves, then maybe talk about CounterPower as well. Feel free. Just take it away. Whatever you feel like is most relevant.
Sure. I'm Jaime. I use she and her pronouns. I am a member of the Richmond, Virginia CounterPower branch, and I have been for about 4 years or so.
My name is Padré. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also in the Richmond branch of CounterPower. And I've been with this group for like a decade.
Wow. Okay, cool. So that's actually interesting. Would y'all tell us about maybe the different branches that CounterPower has around? Because I actually wasn't aware that there are multiple branches.
Yeah, we have comrades in New York and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, Providence, Rhode Island. So a few scattered groups throughout the United States, and we sort of came out of the anti-imperialist wing of the student movement circa 2006 to 2010, I would say, is like the period of our gestation. And we just gradually developed a more organized and cohesive existence as time went on.
Awesome. And are y'all connected to Marxist Center at this point at all? I kind of got the vibe that there was some links there.
Yeah, for sure. CounterPower is an affiliate of the Marxist Center.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Some organizing work that Alex and I did a while back with some various groups around Austin. We were sort of talking about a lot of stuff going on in Marxist Center and in some dialogue. So yeah, I'm actually really kind of excited we're going to get to talk maybe a little bit about Marxist Center and y'all's affiliation with them too. Well, do you all want to just kind of talk a little bit about the book? I mean, this is y'all's book, right? So you want to just give listeners an idea of kind of the work itself, the general overview before we kind of start digging into the nitty-gritty details?
So Organizing for Autonomy, History, Theory, and Strategy for Collective Liberation was published this year, 2020, by Common Notions. And the book itself came out of us cataloging a series of questions that arose in our organizing work and in our work in the left. I think there's a number of different ways you could summarize that process, but one is the tension between more like classical Marxism and like intersectional social theory. I think that comes through in the book. Another would be the tension between class and identity. I think we might frame that a little differently, and I've been tried to frame it differently in the book. But those are some of the tensions theoretically that we were trying to work through. And we sort of just kept track of different questions that came up around social science methodology, systemic analysis, our vision of a communist alternative, and sort of broad strategic and organizational questions. So while aspects of the text are definitely more abstract and theoretical, it did come out of our experiences in labor organizing and tenant organizing and being in the US left milieu with all of its strengths and weaknesses, wonders and problems.
I was going to say, usually my experience...
Yeah, and I think...
Yeah, go for it, Jamie. I was just going to talk shit, so please go for it.
Oh. I was just going to say, and we mentioned like in the introduction, I think too, but it's more just supposed to be like a conglomeration of different like theories on the left and different writers on the left that like often don't get brought together. So rather than kind of being like this new like groundbreaking theory that we've like come up with and put together, it's kind of just taking like little pieces from like a lot of different movements and like compiling them in a way that like I think is really important to compile and like have as a synthesis.
So with CounterPower and the branches and like comrades that y'all have, I mean, I'm curious what your engagement with theory is as like part of the organizing. Like, do y'all have like a consistent sort of, whether it's like reading groups or like theoretical sort of, like kind of set of practices or like ways to engage with theory built into the actual organizing that you do?
Yeah, at the branch level, we have regular political education courses, and there's a good amount of education workers in the organization. I work in secondary education and have been involved in the United Caucuses of Rank and File Educators, or UCOR, which came out of like the Chicago Teachers Union strike. That's where that group's origins go back to. But we have, I think, quite a few people with an interest in experimenting with pedagogy and centering political education in our organization's practices. So in Richmond, we have, I guess it'd be every 4 weeks, we do political education. We alternate between sort of a mass work centered meeting and a political education meeting. So our mass work centered meeting assesses the results of our ongoing organizing work, and then our political education meeting could dive into really any theoretical question. It sort of is in interaction with our mass work. So we try to put those in dialogue. But every 2 weeks we meet and we alternate between those functions.
Yeah. CC, Don, Alex, do y'all have anything you want to touch on before we dig into stuff?
I was just curious if you guys could talk about just the process of writing a book like this as a collective.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you want to say anything about
Well, I think it's like an interesting experience. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a lot of comrades contributed to it, trying to kind of like synthesize the writing and like the thoughts from like a big multitude of people. I think was quite a project, and I will confess, like I was not baselining the writing of the book. I kind of helped more with editing and like kind of talking some stuff through. So comrades that did kind of bottom line the writing of it, I think it was quite a challenge to sort of like get consensus on things and sort of just incorporate these thoughts from so many different people rather than like just sitting down and like with your own thoughts and writing as one person and one perspective.
Yeah, and this goes back, like the general structure of the book goes back like a decade, like a broad outline of some questions that we wanted to dig into. And we sort of sculpted a rough draft of it, circulated it within the organization, got feedback from that, revised it accordingly, and then started threading in historical and theoretical citations and revising certain things or working through things as a group. So actually, like the process of working on the text was, I think, instructive both for how a collective can come to more cohesion around common political perspectives, as well as like produce something that normally like would be done by an academic author, sent off to a publishing house, then they do the editorial work. We did a lot of the initial theorizing, collectively before sending it off to our publisher, who was also very helpful in further revising. But
yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I respect the sort of process that y'all have gone through to make this. I mean, I would say that part of our, pretty clear political platform is to abolish academics. So anything that allows us to theorize from the bottom up, we're big fans. Actually, it's funny because now that you're talking about this, I kind of actually want to ask you the first question that I know we had discussed maybe covering at some point. I'm curious, who would you describe the general audience for the book is whenever you wrote it, and kind of who do you envision, maybe reading and absorbing the theory, and what you would want them to take from it?
It's a great question. It's definitely directed towards revolutionaries and the revolutionary left and people who already have some degree of familiarity with left theory and left social movements today. So within that, I think the milieu we're looking to engage with are people who are skeptical of fitting firmly into the Marxist-Leninist or the anarcho-communist or the Maoist or, whatever box it might be, and trying to disassemble some aspects of communist theory and practice historically and reassemble it in a new body, right? So and we think that there's a milieu of people that are interested in this. I think you see some who gravitates towards like left communism and aspects of anarchism, but aren't fully satisfied with sort of these historical perspectives that arise from like a very specific point in history, right? You think about, we appropriated a lot of elements of council communist theory and practice in this text, but I don't think that consider ourselves like a council communist organization in the historical sense, since the sort of era of that worldview and practice has passed, right? A lot of the interventions that theorists like Gorder or Pennacook, for example, were making were at a very specific time and place. And I think you could say the same thing about thinking about Maoism and the Cultural Revolution, thinking about Marxism-Leninism, Guevarismo. And so there needs to be some disassembly and reassemblage of the component parts of revolutionary communist theory and practice. So that's who we're speaking to, those who are interested in such a project. Whether we accomplished that or not is an entirely different question. This is, we see this as not a final synthesis or, a new immortal science or anything along those lines. This is a very humble and attempt to initiate a process like that.
And it's funny, like, kind of y'all's, like, you know, kind of talking shit on academics. Like, I think, too, it's also just, like, a text for people, like, I mean, you know, the book is very theoretical and, like, we draw on a lot of theory, but then I think, like, we're also trying to, like, give a blueprint for, like, okay, great, that's so awesome that we know this stuff. Now, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to put this into action and, like, put this in the world? So I think it's also, like, a book for people who maybe have, like, read some theory and are, like, interested in stuff, but, like, haven't necessarily translated their theoretical background to, like, practical organizing experience.
Yeah, I think that bridge is one that is incredibly fraught and, like, difficult for a lot of people out organizing. I mean, I know I've definitely seen this where a lot of times it's easy to sort of fall into one of two camps. Either you just want to be like galaxy brain, like just theory pilled all the time, or it's basically like this shit is irrelevant. Like, let's just get down to the bread and butter issues. But I think one of the things that we try to think about is like, what is that bridge between the two? As that bridge seems to be like the place to focus, I think.
Yeah, that's something where I think our projects converge, is a strong conviction that if we're, you know, there's no revolutionary movement without revolutionary theory, and there's no revolutionary theory without revolutionary movement and struggle. And so there's this question of how we translate historical and theoretical knowledge and how we reproduce it or transform it in dialogue with on-the-ground struggles.
Yeah. Well, do y'all want to just maybe kind of walk us through the book? And, you know, if you feel like you want to just go through each section or chapter and just touch on like sort of big broad points, or if there's specific things you want to dive into. I imagine the questions that we have will probably start to, you know, come up as we get into the material, because that's where they were arising from. So y'all are, I was going to say, you're the revolutionary vanguard here today on the show. So feel free to lead us however you see fit.
Well, the book has 4 chapters that cover methodology, analysis, vision, and strategy. Those would be the categories that we would group the text into. So the first chapter, The Weapon of Theory, is an attempt to engage with questions of social science methodology and integrate aspects of systems thinking or systems theory, as well as some aspects of like new materialist philosophy with Marxism, in order to assemble a conceptual framework that could be applied to both an analysis of what we later call the imperialist world system and a vision of communist construction and revolutionary struggle. And so the conceptual framework sort of informs the rest of the project. And I think this comes through in the second chapter on imperialism and revolution, where we describe some aspects of the system that we're up against. The third chapter, envisioning the commune, where we're trying to think through questions of what would a communist social system potentially look like, sort of that sci-fi utopian deep dive. And then the last chapter of building the commune, which outlines some strategic concepts in terms of envisioning what a protracted revolutionary struggle for communism might look like in the 21st century. So that's like the text in its rough outline.
Yeah. So I actually have a question I want to ask y'all, and it's the very first sentence in the introduction. So I found it really interesting that you kind of started off saying, how can we get free? And sort of posing that question at the very beginning, and it always makes me think of the Combahee River Collective anytime that particular phrase comes up. So I'm sort of curious. I mean, I think that there's a tension perhaps, or let's say like a challenge sometimes whenever we're engaged in like revolutionary, even like radical left politics, about like what is the point of what we're doing. And I think, you know, we can talk about material needs a lot, but I find it really interesting to like frame this around freedom and liberation. So I'm going to ask y'all the most philosophical question I can, and also maybe the most difficult question I can think of, which is what is freedom for y'all in the struggle for liberation from capitalism and towards a communist future?
Well, drawing from Marx, I think, you know, we would define communism as a free association of social individuals rationally regulating their metabolism with nature in order to directly satisfy social needs. Absence of that, I don't think that you can have social freedom, right? Because we're talking about the conditions for the integral development of human capacities, the all-around development of human capacities. I mean, that's what I think freedom is about, not petty individualistic conceptions of freedom as a individual abstracted from their social and ecological matrix doing their own thing, but a society that is autonomous in the sense of self-constituting and self-regulating, even thinking about the meaning of autonomy as autonomos, right? To make one's own laws. It's a society that is establishing its own premises for self-reproduction in a way without class hierarchies, without the necessity for a state, without colonialisms and heteropatriarchy.
Would you say that, in a sense, maybe you're trying to, just to be opportunistic here, like abolish the idea of freedom that you might conventionally experience in
I approve
our capitalist worldview, our contemporary capitalist worldview?
Yes, I think we would say that.
Cool.
Definitely.
Fuck yeah, I'm down. Awesome. Yes.
Yeah, and I think kind of like Marx talks about, like how capitalism just sort of like separates like humans from their humanity. So I think like when we speak of freedom, it's also like getting back to the point where like you are free to like develop as a person and like free to develop in like all these different directions and like become more complex and just like more in tune with yourself due to not having like all of these like systemic constraints on you.
Liberating the concepts of freedom and autonomy from lifestyle anarchism and bourgeois individualism. That's one of the
also big thumbs up. Yeah.
They approve.
So okay, I was curious, and maybe Don, I don't know if this is related to one of the questions you wanted to talk about too, but so y'all opened chapter 1 where you talked about our communist politics is grounded by a process of militant research whose goal is to assist in the formation of a collective revolutionary subject. So I think that this idea of a revolutionary subject inherently being, it must be a collective one, I think is a really important question. So I was curious, we can talk through it through the chapter, but how would you all think about what defines or what distinguishes a collective revolutionary subject versus maybe a more like, this is a loaded question, but a bourgeois, atomized, individualistic revolutionary subject?
Great question. So we open this chapter, The Weapon of Theory, with a discussion and a bit of a proposal about what a collective revolutionary subject could be. And we do attempt to rescue the concept of the people, which with the added adjective of a revolutionary people, which comes out of our reading of Latin American Marxism, even the concept of the pueblo, Enrique Dussel, in, I believe, 20 Theses on Politics, talks about this concept of the pueblo, and George Chicarriela-Meyer also sort of appropriates this in his work. But the idea of like the people or the pueblo as a revolutionary collective subject that is composed of multiple social groups with different sectional interests. And it arises in part to address the tension between the traditional or classical conception of the proletarian class subject and the so-called new social movements that arise in the second half of the 20th century. But you even see this anticipated before with Jose Carlos Maria Tegui's concept of the multitude, which has nothing to do with Hart and Negri's concept. But Maria Tegui sort of had this concept of fusing the proletarian class struggle with the struggles of the peasantry and indigenous liberation struggles. And what we're trying to work through is a method for conceptualizing the assemblage of this collective subject from worker struggles, indigenous struggles, Black liberation struggle, feminist struggles, environmental struggles, and how they might fuse together as a collectivity. And that today, the way subjectivity is often discussed, as this question alluded to, is like highly individualistic, right? It's like thinking about social forces that are almost external to oneself, converging on like the individual body, and then like mind and body having like, how would you say, like these external forces that converge on the mind and body to produce an individual subjectivity, rather than it being something that is intrinsically social and collective that's formed through struggle and antagonism, right? So, and this is implicit in class subjects, right? And thinking about the worker versus the boss and the breaking of the command of capital at the point of production. And I think we wanted to expand some of these concepts and bring them into the fields of social reproduction and say that there are somewhat analogous processes there, in terms of the neighborhood or the family, or other sites of struggle being points of antagonism in which collective subjects are formed.
Yeah, Jamie, do you have thoughts about that too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the section just being like against reductionism, I mean, I think that's just like such a struggle, because I think even a lot of times when people talk about, for example, like class and race going hand in hand, it always kind of like, I think in a lot of those conversations, like race is still kind of like subsumed under it. It's like, oh yeah, you can't talk about class without like bringing in race. Like race is a super big part of it, but it's kind of like everything still is like class is like the overarching thing, and like all these other things are kind of just like add-ons. And so I think trying to like kind of, with like popular social groups, in addition to like talking about the proletariat, like how can we kind of like think of like the revolutionary subject as like not necessarily being like the worker in like the traditional sense. Like there's other like aspects of life that like can make someone like a revolutionary, have revolutionary potential. So I think trying to like bring those things together where like they're complementary and they all affect each other, but like, one is not the end all be all and everything else kind of adds on to it, I think is something we were definitely trying to focus on too.
Yeah, I actually think this kind of brings up two related questions that we had that are exactly about this. So I know I was curious to ask y'all, I think you're kind of speaking to this, but typically the claim is that whenever you try to unify these different, seemingly sometimes like contradictory, like mutually exclusive perspectives, like a class politics versus like a new social movement focused on different identities and like social reproduction, there's always this idea of like, well, it papers over these distinctions and tensions and contradictions between those. So I think you all are kind of speaking to that whenever you talk about assemblages and the way that like social movements, especially in like kind of the new left in Latin America, have like sort of approached this. But I was curious. I think maybe Don, this was one of your questions too. Like, how would you all distinguish kind of your particular approach to this question and kind of how you see it maybe being different or unique, or is there a way that you're doing this that you think hasn't really been attempted in just this way before? And yeah, how would you sort of describe what you think makes your approach different?
So I think the Latin American left has, in many instances, and you see this in the work of like Marta Harnacker, where I mentioned Enrique Dussel, and of course before them, Jose Carlos Maria Tigui, this recognition of unity in diversity. And in the US, I think the like Combahee River Collective statement and like sort of intersectional Black feminism definitely have aspects of or analogous analyses with regards to subjectivity, but processed through our neoliberal present, this often leads to like a fragmentation, right? Not a unification of a collective revolutionary subject, but a form of differentiation that leads to sort of these different corners or silos of the movement. So I think all we were trying to do in a very modest fashion is to bring these back into dialogue with one another and to say like look, there will not be a communist social revolution in the United States or probably anywhere else in the world without the sort of dynamic interrelationship between struggles for decolonization and national self-determination and indigenous sovereignty and proletarian liberation from capitalist exploitation, right? Like, for example, similarly, like there will not be a liberated system of social production that directly satisfies human needs and sustains life on this planet if it's not coupled with a radical transformation of social reproduction. And systems theory or ecological ways of thinking, I think, do a lot to point in the direction of how we need to think about revolutionary struggle, and paired with that, how we need to think about a collective revolutionary subject, right? Like the fantasy of returning to some homogenized class subject of like 20th or 19th century vintage is, I mean, that's a pipe dream, I think, to us. And by which, you know, in a double sense. One, there's been actual progress made by particular social struggles, by specific social struggles for Black liberation, for indigenous self-determination, for the feminist transformation of social reproduction, right? We should, rather than view those things as something negative, right, this expands the possibilities of a communist transformation of social life. The other part is that that homogenous class subject never existed, right? It was always internally differentiated. And so that unity often only came after very intense struggles between different fractional components. You think about even, you know, the condition of the condition of the working class in England by Frederick Engels. You know, it doesn't come through in the text, but anyone familiar with the history, who is he studying? Who's he investigating? A colonial subject, a colonial proletariat in the heart of empire, right? So you have the Irish proletariat that has been, you know, dispossessed from their country and forced into the factories of Manchester, and a very gendered subject, right? So these things have always been implicit in communist politics, and I think we're just trying to like tease out a little more at a theoretical level some of these concepts.
Yeah. Y'all have any questions, any thoughts?
No, maybe something was formulating, but I think I need a second to like put it together. Yeah, I don't know. I was just kind of just listening mostly. But that's I like that. I don't know. Yeah, carry on.
If I could say one other thing, just to further complicate things. There is, it's interesting. Something we noticed is the usage of the concept multitude as well as people in Marx's Civil War in France and his writings on the Paris Commune. It's interesting. I don't know if y'all have ever noticed it, but when he's discussing the sort of the insurrection in Paris in 1871 and the formation of the Commune, and there's a discussion of all the sort of different sections of Parisian society that are converging in this revolutionary event. And it's interesting to see that Marx recovers at this moment the concept of the people. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, some inspiration here of thinking about the people not as, and which is why we differentiate it with the concept of a revolutionary people, but not the people of the bourgeois liberal tradition, right? But the revolutionary and insurgent people that is formed through struggle.
So for the idea of a revolutionary people, would it almost be where the people are sort of, it's in itself and for itself, where it has that sort of conscious awareness of what its actual role is historically?
Exactly. And that goes back to the question of, what we term organized autonomy or autonomy within solidarity, right? Like autonomy, we're again trying to rescue from more atomistic conceptions and to situate it within a collective process. So, the people is, what we term the proletarian social groups, or simply the proletariat, combined with the struggles of what we term the popular social groups, popular in the sense of constituent parts of a people, right? In like the Spanish sense, popular, right? Mm-hmm. And like of the people, and sort of united together as an assemblage, that people constitutes a revolutionary subject.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe like the thoughts that were forming earlier for me were kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to come off sounding obtuse when I ask this question, but in what sense do you guys think that those antagonisms between these different perspectives is actually, if it's actually necessary to resolve them, or if they sort of in a sense can continue in a sustained way as a part of struggle, collective struggle. Like, to what degree are these antagonisms going to be resolved, and to what degree is this more of a project of like trying to create a common language of expression for the way that these struggles relate to each other, and kind of having some solidarity through that, or something along those lines. Sorry if that's
not obtuse at all. I mean, I think that's a good question. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, some of these antagonisms, sorry, can't speak, they aren't going to be resolved because they are important and they are historical, and they aren't just going to go away because, we all decided that we're going to unite around the class line or whatever, and I think it is like it's the importance of like being in dialogue with each other and like figuring out like how to relate to each other, and how these different like aspects of the struggle can like work together when need be, and then also kind of like do their own thing and like kind of like take care of different areas when that needs to happen too. So it's not like everything all happening in the same project and everyone lining up behind it. It's more of like there's like different groupings that are kind of like all addressing whatever areas of struggle are like most directly affecting them, and everyone is kind of like backing each other up, kind of thing. That makes sense.
I think this kind of question is so vital for today's left, because I think for what we do on Red Library, the whole aspect or the whole reason to have such a strong theoretical approach to questions like this is because, I think one of the things I'm most critical about in my own history on the left and organizing and, doing the podcast and writing and discussing is how a lot of times we're having discussions or like disagreements about philosophical like core concepts or core questions, but no one ever identifies them as such. So I think one of the things about this tension between, let's say, like a sort of like classes first, and then we talk about identities and their particularities as like secondary things. I mean, I think a lot of times we're having a discussion about what is the relationship between, the universal and the particular. How are we discussing like the difference between identity and difference, or something like, what is the nature of antagonism and how that's like a philosophical, theoretical question that we're offering. I think one of the ones that we don't talk about at all, but is primary, is like a lot of times I think these different questions are grounded in different theories of epistemology and how do we know what we know? How do we relate to each other through how we make sense of the world? So, kind of in this sort of vein, I was kind of curious, like, just from y'all's, I guess, time or, experience, like listening to us and kind of what we're doing. I'm curious, like how you see, we kind of mentioned this, but like, where do you see the linkage or the bridge between maybe kind of what we're doing and kind of how y'all understand your project as well?
Well, I definitely agree that there's a lot of epistemological questions entangled with this. And we can get to it in a moment, but that's where social investigation becomes an important mediating component of one, producing a collective subject, as well as building that knowledge or collective understanding of the social positions that we occupy, and where there are antagonistic contradictions and where there are non-antagonistic contradictions, to use the Maoist concept, which we integrate into some of our thinking about this stuff, right? Where how do we distinguish between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions? I think that would be an interesting question for us to discuss. But in terms of like where we would situate this project in relationship to Red Library's work, I think that y'all want to produce theory for today's left, right? What is today's left might be one of the first questions we should ask ourselves. And that's a highly variegated, diverse amalgam of different theoretical tendencies and theoretical works of a variety of different practical projects and life experiences. And so when we talk about producing theory for today's left, that's also what we're trying to do, engage with actual questions that all of us who have, stepped into this world have had to encounter. The tension between the formation of a proletarian class subject and the specificity of the struggle for indigenous and Black self-determination, right? The tension between being an internationalist, but being in the imperial metropole that is the US. And I think that a lot of these questions run through a lot of the episodes in Red Library.
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly the necessity of turning to, big philosophy and social theory that is often sequestered in academia, not only in a proprietary sense, but in that, there's an assumption of that's where those conversations belong. They don't belong in the streets.
Yep.
They don't belong in our organizations. And we would reject that for sure.
Strong agree.
Yeah. I was going to say that the left that we're wanting to create theory for is the Twitter left. Those are the only ones that really care about trying to make Alex leave the recording and go home. So.
Fuck the Twitter left.
I also agree with that statement.
No, I mean, yeah, there's a place for them in the struggle somewhere. I don't know. Maybe.
We'll figure it out later.
We'll see.
Part of your response to Adam's previous question was talking about this idea of social sciences and a partisan social science that you guys talk about in the book. And I was curious. I think one of the questions that we had sent you all was regarding that as well. And I felt like when I was reading through this, there was like at least when I read through the book, a little bit of an idea of both maybe doing away with a notion of objectivity, but then also at other points maybe just redefining an idea of objectivity. And I didn't know if you guys could kind of talk about how objectivity relates to partisan social sciences.
Yeah, totally. So we definitely don't want to get rid of the concept of objectivity. Mm-hmm. But we do use the phrase strong objectivity, which comes out of feminist science, technology, and society studies, specifically the work of Sandra Harding. You can see her book, Objectivity and Diversity, Another Logic of Scientific Research. And it's interesting because Harding traces the origins of this to Marxism. So I think that there is a tension sometimes where some Marxists don't want to touch the feminist science, technology, and society studies because of an assumed anti-communism or anti-Marxism. And there's definitely anti-communist and anti-Marxist trends within science, technology, and society studies. But Harding traces the origin of standpoint theory to Marxism, specifically to Marx and Lukács and the idea of the standpoint of the proletariat as producing a particular onto-epistemological perspective, and that this is it's particularistic, right? It's local knowledge, if you will, and that we can glean certain insights into the functioning of the capitalist world system by investigating the proletarian standpoint. From this evolves, a whole series of intellectual projects that looked at the life of women. That's one of the classic examples, right? The effect of, say, pharmaceutical research on women's lives, and where sort of the role of gendered psychology and being comes into play in the construction of so-called objective scientific knowledge, right? It was a critique of that. Well, it's funny because this was like the question I felt like I was thinking about extensively. I think it's a great question. So let me try to.
Yeah, and part of my reason for asking it is because it's like I don't, I'm very critical of the way that objectivity has been deployed historically, but I also am uncomfortable like ceding that concept to the other, to the right, and just saying like, oh, let's just get away from it, because I feel like that is very powerful for the other, especially for people who we're trying to convince. And so it's like I both recognize the problem with how it's been used, and at the same time it's like I recognize kind of wanting to get away from it, and at the other hand I'm a little bit hesitant to just be like let's do away with it, because I almost feel like that in some ways feeds into arguments that I've heard with the people that we're in a struggle against. So that's kind of so it's like, to me it's an open question. That's kind of why I wanted to ask it, because I was kind of wanting to know where you all were at with it.
Yeah,
no, I can take a stab at that too, I think, if that's all right, Padré. So I think too, like, that using social investigation in our organizing, I think social investigation is important for theory and development in that direction, but it's also important just for our organizing projects. And I have like some personal anecdotes about that too, where, after like social investigation was conducted, like we were way more successful. Mm-hmm. And like an example of that is like the Richmond Tenants Union is a project that I've been part of. And when we were first starting out as a tenants union, we kind of identified an area that we wanted to go to and try to organize with tenants there. But we didn't really like know much about that area or their landlord yet. Like it was kind of just like, like, you know, communists knocking on doors being like, don't landlords suck? Like, do you hate your landlord? Isn't capitalism like the pits, you know? You know, like sometimes you got like reception from that and people were like, yeah. And then sometimes people were like, no, like what the fuck are you, like who are you? Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Like who the fuck are these people? Who are these white people?
Yeah, like okay, like random people. But then I think like, you know, we kind of stayed with it and we did that for probably like 6 months to a year. We were kind of like targeting that one area. And then when Corona happened and like the eviction crisis kind of, you know, skyrocketed, became way worse than it was before, even though it was already horrible. We were able to kind of like go in and like kind of target that same area and like sort of organize around evictions, but we like knew what we were talking about. And we could say like, we could knock on people's doors and be like, yeah, I heard your landlord's like not fixing the stairs. Like that's messed up. And they're like, I know, like, isn't it? And it was just like such a better connection, like right off the bat. Yeah. So I feel like the social investigation was important for us, just like kind of informing our theory and like kind of informing which direction to take our organizing. But it was also just like, it contributed materially to like the success of our organizing too. Like if we hadn't, I don't know, I feel like if we hadn't really like conducted that survey and we hadn't, you know, really like spent time just like trying to talk to people and get to know their perspective, we wouldn't have been able to like relate to people as much. And I don't know, I'm kind of just riffing here. I've never thought this through before, but like I'm wondering too about, you know, the objectivity question. Like I think the social investigation helps you kind of determine like objectively how a certain group of people feels about something. So maybe their feelings about it aren't like objective, but like those feelings are like, you know, that is like the objective truth, that like these group of tenants in this area feel this way and they feel like this is the problem. And so it's like, you know, and maybe there's more to that problem that people aren't like seeing yet, but like the objective reality is like that they feel this way and like this is what they identify. So that's like, I don't know, that's a thought I had about the objectivity question too.
Cool. Yeah, actually, Jamie, I mean, hearing you talk about that, it brings up something that might, I think, relate to not just theory, but also the practical like implications of how do you put this stuff into practice. So thinking about social investigation, how would you all like either, I don't know, find it to be similar or different than, let's say, like doing mass line and kind of a Maoist approach, or and how you kind of relate those to each other? Because as someone who's done like organizing in a very Maoist fashion, one of the things that I found is that stuff like mass line, talking about, you know, like antagonisms, like that can be, you know, about contradictions or non-contradictions or whatever. I find that like that language gets deployed a lot, but it's also so under theorized that it's kind of like, I have no idea how to even like utilize that as a concept. So yeah, I'm just feel free to like kind of dive into that however you want about, maybe the practical implications of like, like comparing this to mass line versus, and then maybe also like how we talk about antagonism and what does it mean to actually theorize that in a way that makes it useful, as opposed to just like using kind of buzzwords that sound really good, you know, or kind of paper over like I think a really huge problem or gap in like our understanding.
So there's a definite Maoist tinge to some of the concepts that we propose in the militant social investigation segment of the first chapter. And, you know, I think we call it like a dialogic method of, you know, raising consciousness and building organization and struggle. And I think we're indebted to Paulo Freire's particular interpretation of and rendering of the mass line, which I think has more immediate applicability to organizing in our present context, right? Because what is the Maoist mass line, right? It's the idea that in the experience of the masses, there is this objective knowledge that can be used for revolutionary struggle, but it has to be like extrapolated, you know, by the organizer, synthesized, distilled into a program, then returned to the masses. And so there's this, it's very formulaic, right? And there's still the question of what are the masses doing in relationship to the formulation of a program, right? In the Maoist mass line conception, it's the party that formulates the program, returns it to the masses. And I think that we should dig into that a little more and critique it, because I just don't see, I've seen that play out really badly in a lot of different cases. And so we wanted to rescue some of the good aspects of it, namely the dialogue component, right? So like Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed takes Mao's idea of the mass line and synthesizes it with a few other perspectives to produce his dialogic pedagogy, where sort of in the experience of the learner, there's like lessons that can be drawn out by the teacher. But Freire has an important thing, which is that the programmatic aspect has to be co-formulated by the participants themselves. And so when we outline in our conception of militant social investigation, it's not necessarily the job of the organizer to distill in a mechanical sense from the experience of the masses the program that then they return, and here's your revolutionary program, we hope you like it. But people have to be involved in the actual co-formulation of it. And this is like, you think about teaching, same thing with teaching, right? If students aren't involved in the production of knowledge, right? Knowledge is produced. It's not in the banking system of education. We have to reject that. Knowledge isn't something that's inserted into the heads of the students. It has to be produced through a collective process. And this applies to social investigation, because what is that? You're producing knowledge that is useful to revolutionary struggle. And so the organizer is more of a catalyst, more of a maybe co-facilitator, through which a revolutionary program could be formulated. But I think we would question whether sort of the role of cadre is to formulate the program and return it to the masses. And this has to do with, to return it to the question of strong objectivity as well, right? Which is that like the masses of people have to sort of recognize in their own experience that objective analysis, that objective component, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think just like bringing pieces of that into like conversation, like slowly as you like build a relationship, is just so much more organic, and people are so much more receptive to it than like kind of starting off with like, okay, yeah, like contradictions, like let's, kind of like go right down that rabbit hole right from the get-go. I think can be kind of like off-putting for people who aren't used to talking about that stuff. But once they've kind of like had barbecues with you and like hung out with you and like had meetings and stuff, then it's like more natural to kind of insert that stuff a little and like bring it up and see what people think. So I think that just the process of that being like very long, and being like, a long-term thing that you kind of have to invest in, I think is an important point too.
Yeah, I actually think what you're saying is such a crucial component, where there has to be this relational dimension to how that discussion about like more abstract concepts is going to play out. I think that's what I've seen is like a major flaw. We've actually been talking about this more and more, of just how if you're going to put this stuff into practice, it's going to necessitate in some ways like challenging potentially really directly your own sort of struggles about how you relate to other people as part of the collectivity. I think that's something that's a really serious thing that anyone on the left today, especially if they're wanting to organize, has to grapple with. It's like, what are the things that might limit you from being able to do that? Not that everyone has to be knocking on doors, but if you are going to be engaging in a collective way, I think you have to take that seriously enough to like kind of reflect on what are my own challenges and like skepticisms or, like potential blockages to being able to do that. And I think the idea of like, it has to be a relational sort of foundation for me. I think that's why like, my background in social work, I think is actually like a really great thing for organizing work, because you get trained in like how to build relationships and safety and trust. And it's like, that's kind of what good organizing work comes out of, I think.
It's so interesting you say that, because I'm a school counselor, and so my counseling training, like when I was going through that, I was like, oh my god, I'm just like learning how to have like a one-on-one like organizing. This is amazing. Like there's so much overlap with that, with just like reflecting people's reflecting people's thoughts back to them, and like kind of showing empathy and like what a big role that plays. I think like the relational aspect of cadre organizations and political parties even is something that's like so underemphasized. And I think that's one thing like CounterPower has done a really good job of, like, since I've been a part of it from the get-go, like just making sure that everyone feels like they are like an important part of a community. And like I think like something that sort of speaks to that, and like the fact that we do a good job of that, is like we don't really have like this like revolving door of members that like I think a lot of other groups tend to have. Like people, once they kind of like come around, and granted it's not like a mass membership org, so it is like a little bit, it takes more time I think for someone to like join CounterPower, but like once they do, like I think people stick around, just because like we have been really intentional about cultivating like relationships and taking care of each other, and you know, kind of having that like community aspect of things, which yeah, I mean without that I just feel like we're not going to win. Like we need to make people like feel good about the spaces that they're in, you know.
Well, the way we've been doing it, we obviously haven't won yet. So there's something that has not been working. So
it's amazing how many leftist organizations you want to talk about, you know, community and unity and stuff like that are just horribly toxic and terrible places.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's definitely like an art to the process. It's almost like what, you know, like to come back to like what you were originally asking, Don, about like objectivity and sort of this like partisan aspect of you know, this like social science that we're talking about, right? This like Marxist dialectical thing, right? Is like, it's not so much objective in the sense that in like the bourgeois sense, right, of like true in all cases, right? It's almost like you have to work to convert both your own perspective on objectivity into something that is compatible with what a community needs, and work to destroy or dissolve that like bourgeois conception of objectivity from being something that only applies in like these like neutral, cold, scientific ways, and rather now should function in like this warm, embodied, like dedicated, you know, implicated way on the part of the community. And like, you know, that, like I said, it's kind of like an art. Like it almost takes that kind of training, like that counseling training or like social work training or like, you know, psychological understanding of like human emotion and like how people relate to these struggles, to even be able to communicate it sometimes, and to even be able to tease it out of a member of a community that wants to be involved. So yeah, I don't know, it's a struggle. But
I mean, I think maybe something else that's like a really theoretical implication of all this that I've seen as well is that a lot of times I think whenever you're organizing in this way, even if you're like a Maoist and like using the mass line and this idea of like, oh, like we're going to investigate, we're going to take your experience and then we're going to transform it into a program and bring it back to you. I think in this, in a certain way, this is why I'm like very, very skeptical, or at least initially critical of a lot of times whenever anyone like on the left is talking about like scientific investigation and objectivity. Like I'm very similar to what Don is saying. It's like I don't want to abandon those things at all. But I think the way that they get deployed is very much assuming like the bourgeois atomized individual is doing the scientific investigation in this like cold neutral way, and that it sort of assumes the banking model that Freire is talking about. And I think the thing that really turned my perspective on this, actually doing organizing work in this vein, was how it never seemed that you yourself would be transformed in the process. You know, it was like you were always the one that was like outside of it, like functioning in a subjective way. And I was like, this doesn't seem to fit into the idea of like a collective revolutionary subject. We should also be changed and transformed through the process of this. And I think that, you know, people like the Zapatistas, right, and their process, I think is a good example of this. But that's one of the things that always has made me very skeptical, is that it just never seems that it's going to transform you as well. And I don't really buy anyone's, no matter how good of a game someone talks, like I don't buy their shit if it doesn't seem like they're open to being changed themselves in the process.
Yeah, like you can't be like the cold surgeon of a community, right? Like you have to like somehow be like implicated in the surgery.
Yeah, you yourself have to be implicated in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and that's like what we mean by like partisan social science, right? That we are implicated in the research process and in the co-production of scientific knowledge, right? And that there are political aims entangled in that research process, and that doesn't make it less objective, right? Hence, strong objectivity. And strong objectivity is different from that clinical, detached, disembodied objectivity, and where it's, you know, as Sandra Harding points out, where strong objectivity is similar to conventional conceptions, it's that, yes, research should be fair to evidence, It should be fair to one's critics, and it should be fair to the most severe criticisms one can imagine, even if those haven't been articulated yet. And that's very different from the way objectivity sometimes gets talked about on the Marxist left. Sometimes it gets talked about in this very clinical, disembodied sense, as if there's this rarefied knowledge contained in proletarian minds, and it is the task of, the party or the Vanguard or whoever it might be to extract that knowledge, right, and distill it, formulate a program, and then present it back to the unknowing proletarian mind so that it can be internalized and actualized. And that's not actually how scientific knowledge is produced in either context, either in the political context in which we're producing social scientific knowledge, or in the more traditional natural science, medical science mode either, which is, of course, where these ideas come from, right? The idea of strong objectivity arose out of the male chauvinist, heteropatriarchal, and racist Western conceptions that were embedded in that supposedly disembodied sort of quote-unquote objective scientific process.
Yeah, I think for me too, this is why I don't really think you can be very sufficiently critical on the left today without a good helping of Foucault in this respect. The understanding that to claim or to elevate this idea of like scientific objectivity uncritically is in a way like to claim a certain kind of discourse of power. And I think, in a lot of ways, like it's pretty destructive and counterproductive, I would say as well, to not understand that, essentially like you talking about scientific objectivity isn't so much about, like it isn't as sort of like beneficent as you think it is. It's like, it's a way that like you're trying to actually sort of assume the very structures and logic of power of the capitalist like technological regime itself to like make you feel maybe like more, I don't know, like valid or somehow like fitting into this discourse that I think to me feels that should be the thing that we're actually against. That's part of this thing that we're struggling against, is this sort of way that, truth and like power and knowledge, how all these things are deeply embedded in the structures of capital and like patriarchy and white supremacy and everything else. So I think that's also something that to me feels necessary, is like a really deep theoretical thing that has to be engaged with, is like, okay, well, like, what does it mean to talk about objectivity? What does that do for you? Like, what are you claiming by utilizing that signifier, and like what do you hope it's going to get you? And again, doesn't mean that like we want to abandon that, but we have to be really critical about what we think it means.
And the scientific verification process through which something is determined as being objective or not objective is intrinsically social and collective, right? That's another argument that we're making, is that there is a scientific community, right? Peer review, if you will, that is integral to that process. When we're talking about militant social investigation or partisan social science in the service of communism, that makes it something a little different, right? Because we're not talking about verification through an academic community. We're talking about verification through a collective process of struggle in which the subjects implicated in that process are playing a part in verifying the objectivity or non-objectivity of certain conclusions. Hence the necessity of, Freire's concept of like problem posing education, right? That people have to be involved in identifying what would actually be the best solutions to the contradictions and antagonisms that they find themselves objectively entangled in.
I was just laughing because I was imagining that we could have some sort of like modern left where we can engage in a process of peer review among each other without it being sectarian. I feel like that's kind of what I really want. I want peer review without sectarianism.
Well, that's what the last chapter of this book, in a certain sense, is all about that. And I think part of the key to conceptualizing what a left peer review process that wasn't sectarian would look like would require a deeper knowledge of systems theory and organizational science, or organizational ecology, for example. We tend to have very rigid, almost 19th, early 20th century conceptions of the way an organizational ecology functions that is clearly not working. So
Well, I think in a true Red Library fashion, we've spent most of the episode just on chapter 1. I don't know if we should maybe move on. I don't know if we want to hit on some of the other chapters. Before we move on.
Yeah, what do y'all think? Yeah, what else do you want to cover?
Yeah, if there's anything in particular you guys want to talk about, because I know, like we said, we haven't really moved past that first chapter, but I feel like there's so much in this book. Most of my questions that I was asking were related to other parts of the book, and we're like very much more in like this sort of maybe playful philosophical mode. I know you guys are like really curious about like the project and like what it all means, but I was just sort of like, well, what do you think about, I was like, what do you think about
one of your questions,
rabble rousing and like, intimate partnerships and like what, this is all interesting information to me. So I don't know. My question was like, I saw that you quoted George Jackson on page 70, and it resonated with me, but at the same time, I was kind of like, well, so, I feel like there are things that, like we were talking about before in organizing, that function on an interpersonal level, and are extremely effective in like inspiring and motivating people, and, also like learning about your own implications and in the struggle. And like, I guess I just was curious about like, I feel like we've maybe answered this question in a lot of different ways already, but like just at that point in my reading, I was kind of like, well, so, what is the project? Like how does the reading of a book like this relate to that type of interpersonal engagement in a community? And like, how might this book be related to those moments in organizing that are interpersonal? Like, I guess it's like, I appreciate like laying out a project and having like a greater vision, but I just, I don't know. Maybe this isn't even really a very well-formed question, but I think for me, when I was reading it, it really brought up this question of like, how much of this text can really be communicated in this sort of textual fashion, like just reading a book and understanding a project, like a greater project, like how much implication can be conveyed in that manner. And maybe this is like more philosophical question than anything, and I know this may be hard to answer, but how much of this project do you think really requires for us to be engaged with the community and be communicating all of these principles and thoughts to people interpersonally?
I think like just the question of like theory informing practice. I think like it is important to kind of have, especially I think in this book, like the vision and the strategy section. I think that when we're, coming together as organizers or as communists, I think it is important to like, find a way to be able to like kind of bring this to the people that we're organizing with, right? I think this isn't meant to just be like, a philosophical book club read. Like, it is meant to be something that gets like taken forth, but at the same time, like, it is written in theoretical language, so it's not for someone who like doesn't have any background of left politics either. I think it is more for like the person who knows knows a little bit about left theory, is thinking about how to like apply those different theories to their organizing. And I think that this is like the kind of thing where like, I don't know, comrades should like read it together and like talk about it and be like, I don't know, in what way, like, how can we like make a strategy to like execute like this, goal that we have or whatever? How can we use social investigation, going back to that, to like kind of help us with this project? So I think it's more just like a book that's like meant to like spark dialogue between comrades than it is like, I don't know, necessarily like something that would just be like given directly to like the masses of people or whatever.
It's not y'all's little red book.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
We're gonna speak only in Mal quotes from this point forward.
Yeah, I think what we're speaking to here is the task of translation and like the translation at different registers. So, there's the example, like a classic example would be like Marxian value theory, which can go to extreme detail and become very complex and, sort of Marxism's version of quantum theory, right? But that doesn't make the general critique of value any less applicable to organizing in the workplace or in the community, and engaging, our fellow workers around questions of exploitation and capital's regime of value extraction, right? So there's like different registers one can speak to these concepts at, and the task of an organizer and organizations is to translate them. So this is not a popular rendering of, our particular sort of Marxian systems theory and analysis of imperialism and vision of communism and strategic orientation to achieve it. Is not a short, concise, popular rendering of it, but more of a historical and theoretical distillation. And I think our future projects are to create more popular renderings of some of the concepts and analyses that are presented in this text.
Yeah, I find that answer really interesting because I think reading the book, I think y'all, are clearly saying like, here's what we think like communism is. I mean, I'm just kind of for an example, because I realize I always like to read quotes from the book on the show. So you, it's on page 83, you say, communism is a social revolution at point zero that is focused on the question of reproduction, intended as the complex of activities and relations by which our life and labor are daily reconstituted. And communism aims for radical transformations on the terrain of social reproduction, creating a new molecular basis for the ongoing material reproduction of everyday life, rooted in the principle of autonomy within solidarity. So, which I kind of read as y'all's way of formulating like the universal and the particular and universal and how they relate. I like hearing y'all talk about that in response to Alex's question. I mean, I would read that and I would say like, that's obviously like a very clear, like, this is our definition of what this is. But thinking about how does this work interpersonally or actually on the ground, it seems almost more like you want to like pose questions for people, or you want people to engage in a sense of like, not so much like we need to adopt this definition and run with it per se, but more of like, we want to stimulate and generate questions, which I actually think is the real purpose of like theory and philosophy, is not necessarily like, here's the answers to this stuff, but what are ways to reframe and re-ask the questions to open up new possibilities or reveal fractures or gaps in different ways. So, I mean, I don't know, like, kind of how y'all, I mean, maybe this is getting super meta, but it's like, what do you think the purpose of philosophy and theory are? I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. So I don't know. I'm curious how y'all would think about that.
Philosophy would be hard, personally speaking, because I'm not sure if I fall into the philosophy or anti-philosophy camp yet. That is a question I will probably be trying to resolve for the rest of my life. With regard to theory, that's a little more easy to answer in the sense that, the reason we call it partisan social science is that we think revolutionary social theory should help make a revolution. It should help us ask questions that can inform our practice, that can, develop forms of organization and struggle that can actually initiate an insurrectionary rupture with this system and build a better world. I mean, that's the part of the function of revolutionary theory more generally, and science more generally, right, is about self-understanding of our place in the universe or the multiverse, right? Of thinking about our existence from a relational standpoint, both within a social system and our social system's embeddedness within a larger ecological system.
Well, I've got some other questions. I wanted to talk about, intimate partnerships and stuff. I had a question about that, but I feel like because we're kind of getting close on time, maybe we'll just jump to the last question that I had, which was more about, throughout the work, we talk about the protractedness of this struggle, and that this is something that is going to have to be built, over a long period of time, and this is going to be an enduring mode of engagement. And like I understand that, and I obviously I agree, but I guess coming back to something that we kind of talked about earlier, with regard to sort of like the uniting of a lot of struggles under a certain common parlance, or like a common way of referring to the struggle that we're all, a part of. I guess I just worry, like, what is going to make the urgency of the struggle more apparent? And I know that there's probably lots of ways that you address this throughout the work, but I think overall, they're just, despite all of the contradictions of our society being like right in front of our faces, it's extremely difficult to like awaken in people a feeling of urgency. And I just wonder how sometimes that protractedness of this struggle ends up turning into like, you know, just like that whole paradox of like only being able to go halfway ever, and like never quite reaching these deeper like steps into the future of like this project. And so I know that's like a question that trying to answer that in 20 minutes is probably unfair, but I just, you know, these are my questions. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just like what comes to mind for that question is like, yeah, like the struggle is protracted, but that doesn't mean we can like wait on it. Like we got to start like yesterday. Like it's a long one, and it's gonna be really hard, and everyone's got to be helping. Just like sitting around and, you know, doing things here, you know, here and there. Like we gotta start on this major project like immediately. And so I think that would be, yeah, I definitely have felt frustrated with like that lack of urgency that you see all around you. I mean, me and Padre were just talking about that earlier, where it's like everything is crumbling, and it just seems like most people are like going about their daily lives.
This is fine,
like
you know.
like, yeah, this is totally chill. We're not like everything's not collapsing. No big deal. So I mean, I think it is important to like try to like awaken that urgency in people for sure. But for people who already have that sense of urgency, I think like kind of like reminding people and like reminding each other that like we're not gonna like win tomorrow. Like this is like a long ass process. I mean, I think like I'm definitely a person who needs that reminder a lot too, because especially with like organizing stuff, like I just want results like right away, and I want to like see like the outcome of my efforts and stuff. And I think just like kind of taking a step back and being like, listen, you know, this is gonna be a long haul. We're gonna like chip away at this slowly, and like that doesn't mean that like we are not working really hard at it. But I think it's just more a way of like keep going, even when you don't like win like next year or whatever, right? Like it's gonna be a long process. So yeah, I mean, I think that can be kind of like reassuring. It's like, all right, you're not like fucking up. Like you're doing a good job with your organizing efforts. It's just like it's inherently just going to take a long time.
Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, I think I definitely vibe with what Jamie was saying about the real time but slow motion dematerialization of, you know, I see it as a teacher, like so many things that should incite such rage and resistance that are accepted as a part of the status quo. And so how does a revolutionary instill in people that fighting spirit and the necessity of struggle, right? And I think when we used the description of a protracted revolutionary struggle, right, and we outlined sort of 4 phases, from laying the groundwork, which is synonymous with developing the organizational infrastructure of a revolutionary movement through mass organizations and a party organization and a defensive capacity of that movement, and sort of threading together those different parts into a united front, leading towards a dual power situation or the emergence of territorial counterpower, as we call it, which ultimately culminates in an insurrectionary rupture that smashes the state and lays the groundwork for a new social system, right? That can then subsequently subordinate the remnants of the old society to itself, establish its own premises for self-reproduction, and hopefully lead us on the road to world communism, right? Little, not hard at all.
Just a few steps, you know.
No big deal.
And you know, when we like outline them as phases, it's like we use the phrase grand strategy, meaning it's grand strategy. This is not an operationalization of these concepts. That's something that is going to be determined through a much more torturous, nitty-gritty historical process that, you know, we can't anticipate the precise contours of. That would be absurd. But I think, you know, revolutionary practice in the past can give us some indicators as to how it's probably going to go, or at least certain prerequisites to get to a certain destination. But to answer your question, I think this is where Rodrigo Nunes's work comes into play. Rodrigo Nunes wrote this book, Organization of the Organizationless, and also has a book coming out that I'm really looking forward to. That is a very critical engagement with the concepts of horizontalism and horizontality and verticality. And Nunes has this idea called the Vanguard Function. And it would be a longer conversation. I highly recommend comrades engage with this concept and critique of the Vanguard Party is one thing, or the Vanguard as a sort of definite instrument of struggle. That's not what Nunes is talking about. Nunes is talking about that within any revolutionary movement, there are vanguard functions that are actually distributed throughout the movement and might rotate between different sectors of the struggle. And that each sort of historical turning point, the reason we progressed to the next phase is because some sector of struggle, some organized force within the broader movement ecology begins to occupy a vanguard function. Historically, we've seen this with the Black liberation struggle. At certain points, we've seen, specific worker struggles, right? It's not worker struggles in general. It's usually workers concentrated in a specific industrial sector or even a specific workplace. You think about like the Fiat factories in Italy during the 70s were like epicenters of revolutionary worker struggle because of a variety of factors that converged, right? The migration of Southern Italian migrants as well as international migrants who were working in the Fiat factories, combined with sort of the student New Left, produced this explosive situation where then they become the cutting edge of that struggle and they indicate a direction forward, right? And so I think the way you progress through different phases of revolutionary struggle is there emerge forces that perform a vanguard function. This can't be determined in advance necessarily. Like, you can't say we're going to perform, CounterPower is going to perform the vanguard functions that we move to the next phase. That's highly unlikely. These are emergent properties, to use systems terminology, right? They emerge from a specific organizational ecology and they point to the next direction. And we've seen this, I think, you just see it throughout history. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, anti-fascist struggles, struggles for migrant autonomy. There's many different examples that we could point to that perform what could arguably be considered a vanguard function, pointing us to what is the next series of tasks and how do we move to that next phase of struggle.
So maybe kind of on this point, I actually wanted to ask you all about it. I'm glad we're bringing this up. So this is on page 143, and this is a section I thought was, it really got my attention, and I think it's related to what you all are talking about now. So right in the book, it says, from tactical united fronts formed to win immediate objectives to strategic united fronts formed to pursue a revolutionary program, the ultimate culmination of this organizational process is the articulation of a system of counterpower from within an emergent area of autonomy. So I was curious to ask y'all kind of two questions about this. One, how would you distinguish counterpower from dual power, if at all? And maybe the second one would be, if we're talking about, our context, right, even understanding this internationalist, anti-imperialist perspective, we're in the U.S. right now. And I think the particular unique aspects historically and politically about the U.S. for preventing a situation of dual power or counterpower, I think is one that we have to wrestle with really seriously. Because whenever I think about situations of dual power, usually it required a very weak state that would allow those spaces to sort of be able to develop a sense of autonomy. Or even if we were talking about like Rojava, right? Like the only reason like they were able to develop that, the Kurds were, is precisely because of the weakness of the Syrian state during the civil war. So for me, I think whenever we talk about like developing a workers' party in the US, I think we always have to ask the question of like, well, why haven't we been able to develop one? And are there structural restrictions and limitations around us being able to use this strategy here? So anyway, I know that's a lot, but I guess, yeah, just to kind of recapitulate. So one, differences between dual power and counterpower, and yeah, maybe how you see, are there particular limitations around this because we're in the U.S. and based on our own political structures and history?
To provide a very concise answer to the first question, at least in the text, we use dual power in a very specific way. Mm-hmm. Dual power would be like a situational description. You would have a situation of dual power that emerges when you have a weak state, for example, and the power of empire is perhaps waning, at least its hegemony, right? And popular organs of counterpower, right? As we emerge, historically, you've seen, Soviets, councils, action committees. There's probably many other forms we could name, but those forms embody the nucleus of a new social system that, if the state was decisively defeated, smashed, those organs could potentially take over the functions of social governance, right? So a dual power situation is an intrinsically unstable situation. I think we define it after a revolutionary movement has had a period of gestation. It's been able to grow and develop. It has its own alternative culture, its own network of mass organizations, party organizations, right? It has a high degree of legitimacy among the population. And a situation of crisis emerges, we could speak of a potential for a dual power situation. I think we say, with the emergence of territorial counterpower, this phase marks the leap from diffuse areas of autonomy to a consolidated system of territorial counterpower. The previous phase can force an unstable period in which the nucleus of a communist alternative contends with a decaying imperialism for hegemony. The task of a social revolution at this conjuncture is to accelerate and coordinate the consolidation of areas of autonomy with the goal of extending liberated zones throughout the territory and linking together organs of counterpower, people's defense organizations, and parties of autonomy. This is the phase of dual power, a revolutionary crisis that arises from the irreconcilable conflict between a revolutionary people and a counter-revolutionary ruling class. In this phase, a communist alternative emerges, establishing the material foundation for a direct transfer of power from the imperialist ruling class to the proletarian and popular social groups. So it's situational for dual power, versus you could say, well, the rest of the labor movement is defined by very reformist trade unionism, but in this one factory, we've built a workers' council, and you could say that workers' council is an organ of counterpower, right? Could it contend with the state? No, it could not. Could it contend with capital at the systemic level? No, it could not. But would you maybe accurately describe it as an organ of counterpower? Yes. Would that be a dual power situation? Well, maybe if you mean dual power in one factory, but we mean dual power in a more situational and social sense. It's something that would actually be a crisis throughout the whole social system. Jamie, do you want to address the question of the U.S. empire?
You get the easy one, Jamie.
I think yes, obviously, I think that being in the U.S., there's major limitations to building like a revolutionary communist party. I also wonder, though, like whether that limitation is just more like immediate for us than it is in other places, because that limitation exists for everybody in the world. Like the US is gonna come, like regardless of where you're organizing. If you get good enough and powerful enough, like the US is gonna like try to break that. So for us, I think it's a lot more immediate, and so it's more of like it's in our backyard kind of thing. But the cool thing is, if that we were to successfully do that in the US, like we're the only country that the U.S. like can't really invade, right? So like, if we were to do it, that'd be pretty cool for everyone else in the world, wouldn't it? Like, yeah. So I think that there's definitely, it's definitely something to contend with. But I don't know that it's like a limitation to the point where it's impossible. I just think that we have a lot more. We have it right over our shoulder, as opposed to like across the ocean.
And there are possibilities that systemic crises will hit in the near future that could alter the balance of forces if we get our shit together. We have a tremendous responsibility to get organized, but we can't necessarily impose organizational forms prior to the conditions necessary for their emergence. Though I do think we're on the definitely on the party building side of things, in the sense that it is a task for revolutionaries to unite into organizations. I think we have a very specific take on what that means, and think it's deeply important to develop a non-sectarian practice in which, again, no one's positing to have the one true line for the whole movement, but more of a emergent approach to that, right? That we can think about multiple party organizations emerging and meshing together. And when a revolutionary situation emerges, which who knows when that might happen, but there's the convergence of crises of an economic and environmental character combined with geopolitical crises that could create circumstances, in our lifetime where the US empire may find itself in serious shit, and a revolutionary movement might actually be able to contend for power. That's going to be a lot of work.
Well, I think maybe just kind of very practically speaking too, I think near the end of the book, I guess like whenever you talk about like a revolutionary movement, I always kind of wonder, like, what do we mean when we say movement? And this is on page 177. You say, as the imperialist world system has already adopted a networked approach to counter-revolution through forms of interagency cooperation, revolutionaries will be wise to recognize that, quote, it takes a network to fight a network, unquote. So, I also get the sense that this is where like systems theory and talking about like maybe cybernetics and the importance of networks is also for y'all like part of what you like the vision and the sort of, I don't know if you would call it a program, but definitely that's the strategic orientation is like the whole point is to like for developing these organs of counterpower, but then to have them networked in a particular way, which I would assume is going to have implications for how they relate to each other, how autonomy versus, sort of unification across multiple regions and areas would need to function. So, again, maybe it's just kind of like a general thought, but it does seem like what a revolutionary people for y'all would mean would actually be like it would function as a network.
Definitely. And I think part of this is the systems approach would say, well, networks are a part of our objective reality, right? Like networks aren't something new, and they're also not something you choose. It's a question of what type of network do you construct. And I think that the alter globalization movement and some of the theory that came out of that era has muddied the waters quite a bit in that we posit network as synonym for horizontalism. We posit network as synonym for a specific organizational form. But the reality is every state is a network. Every corporation is a network. Every communist party that's ever existed is a network and can be understood through network terms. It's a conceptual framework for analyzing social relations, the flow of information, the processes through which decisions are made. And so we draw from the counterinsurgency literature that emerged in the 80s and 90s in response to the revolutionary movements in Central America, the concept of a spin network, a segmentary, polycentric, integrated network system, I think is, if I remember the acronym correctly. But the FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional, the FMLN in El Salvador. You also had in Guatemala, the National Revolutionary Unity in Guatemala was the organization. And these were actually networks of multiple party organizations, which also had contained within them networks of mass organizations, such as peasant associations, trade union caucuses, community organizations, all different student groups, cultural associations, etc. And so what we need to figure out is what type of network do we need to fight the imperialist world system? And what constructive work can we begin today to lay the foundation for it? I have more thoughts on it, but
keep going.
Yeah.
So I think we want to challenge some of the inherited wisdom from the turn of our century with regards to, again, horizontality and verticality around systems and networks. And there is a desire, at least I've noticed it on the part of some comrades, to return to this 19th or 20th century conception of the party. And specifically, the party and the class or the party and the masses, and to recycle some of these, I think, very mechanical conceptions of the way revolutionary consciousness and organization and struggle happens. And the idea that some hierarchical mass party of like the 19th century model will reemerge, there is a high burden of proof, I think, on that. You need you would need to harness some serious historical evidence, because even the mass parties that remain today, they don't function on that basis. Like, I guess you could look at the PSUV in Venezuela. You could look at MAS in Bolivia. They don't function like that. They emerged from very complex, multitudinous networks that had decades to generate. So in Venezuela, the PSUV, there's all types of, you think about the colectivos, you think about the guerrilla movement, you think about trade union movements and peasant movements, you think about the left opposition inside the military. It wasn't like one day just the party is founded and like then it's constructed or something like that. It was more of an emergent process, and roughly analogous in MAS. Obviously, there's its own history there as well. But there was multiple sort of trends, tendencies, organizational forms that converged to produce that party as an instrument of struggle at a very specific historical conjuncture. It would be difficult to replicate that, I think, in our present situation, which isn't to say that it's impossible. It's just to say that this sort of party first, we're going to build the party, and then the party will conquer power. And like, I just don't see that happening. I think it'll be more of a diffuse process that won't be less coordinated, that won't be less organized. I mean, I think that's exactly what we want to militate against, is these sort of very idealistic and ultra-left conceptions of horizontality, of the network in this very subjective sense, as being universally good, right? Like, that is not true at all. That's why we talk about the formation of like a system of counterpower. Embedded within it are party organizations and mass organizations that have certain leadership and coordinating functions. It's just a different way of conceptualizing this, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I will say for me, one of the things that I really resonate a lot with kind of hearing you describe it that way, and what y'all are interested in doing as part of your project, that I think aligns very strongly with at least how I would conceptualize what we're trying to do, is that we kind of need, like, the function of theory today is kind of twofold, or like what we need to be utilizing it for as a weapon is kind of twofold. One, I think, to basically like radically reframe how we think about what certain words or concepts or theoretical concepts mean for us today. And I think in a lot of ways is like a weirdly almost like psychoanalytic kind of thing, is to be like, oh, network. Well, what do you mean by network? And just like posing it as a question, and like in providing an opportunity to like work through like what exactly is happening and how those concepts function for us, because it does have material implications. I think like that's part of it, but I think the other piece of it is to sort of like just ruthlessly destroy like idealistic and mythological interpretations of the past and like how things function. Like the idea of like whenever people talk about a party, it's like I think that usually it functions in those two ways. It means that like, we want the party to do something for us now, but it's almost always, in my experience, based on a completely skewed and very sectarian reading of what actually the party was and how it functioned in the first place. So to me, I think that's part of kind of what we have to do, is we have to sort of simultaneously kind of do these two things.
Absolutely. And embrace a less competitive attitude, both towards the production of theory and the construction of organization, which isn't to say less critical, right? Like you're just saying, to destroy idealistic conceptions of the past that we've inherited. Absolutely, right? That's got to be part of it. But also we need to learn to like, how can we communicate with one another? I don't think that the U.S. left knows how to communicate is like a part of this.
We're very bad at it.
We're terrible at it, which is where, that psychoanalytic component might be really important, right? Yeah. How do we develop the capacities to communicate with one another in such a way that we can construct a common orientation, or at the very least, a minimal basis of working together without strangling one another?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not super interested in competing for social capital with other leftists these days. That's kind of a very strong orienting coordinate that I have.
Good.
Hard agree.
Yeah, hard agree. I mean, we're kind of right at like 1:00. Do y'all have anything else you wanted to throw out? Questions, comments, thoughts?
Is there anything that you guys want to add before the end of the episode? I know we've taken up a lot of your time already.
I don't know if I have any like burning points to make that weren't already covered personally. Cool. What about you, Padré?
I think we covered some of the some good ground. I'm really appreciative of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Any concluding thoughts? I feel like we got to have some concluding thought, though.
Yeah, I think just kind of going off of what you were just talking about too, with this like competition of ideas and stuff, and like this like competing for social capital and like competing to have like the right theoretical formation and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like absolutely. I mean, I think that's like kind of what like the book and like our kind of like position is about too. Or it's like there's like other groups that have like completely different takes on things, but like we're still like aligned for the most part, and like there's no reason like we don't need to like snatch your members away or like convince them that we're right and everyone needs to like be a CounterPower member and we need to like all be under the same banner. Like it's like okay to have a lot of these disagreements, I think, and I think it's like healthy and good to like kind of encourage that and just like be okay with it and like accept that instead of being like, okay, no, like we're right, we're right, we're like not backing down from this, like being in dialogue and like being able to like admit when you're wrong and like admit that you're still learning about a certain area, and like maybe this group has like a better like theory on it, and like maybe you need to like kind of sway towards them in like this one respect, and maybe they're going to sway towards you in another respect. Like I think all that is healthy and good, and I think just like bullshit Twitter, like like left infighting stuff is just like, it's not going to get us anywhere. Like, I think, just kind of like being comradely about this stuff is so important.
Yeah, developing that comradely cooperation is in part what I think we were trying to do with this text, and whether we succeeded in that is a different question, but certainly future projects of translating some of the themes in it, I think will speak to exactly this question: is how do we pose multiple questions for the revolutionary left today that don't have a singular answer? There's a multitude of ways that we can articulate and co-produce knowledge that would be useful for revolutionary struggle. There doesn't have to be a singular vision of revolutionary science and communist alternative. In fact, it's positive that if we can create spaces where multiple perspectives are exchanged, put into dialogue with one another, and if there is anything roughly approximating a final unity, it will only be the result of a process like that, rooted in dialogue, self-critical questioning, and the summation of experience, both historical and contemporary.
Yeah, it would be like true, genuine unity, not like forced unity, I guess. Like way more sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're against the banking idea of unity, right? Like, to take Paulo Freire's idea. We do not want to superimpose unity. Unity has to be constructed in the trenches of struggle, and part of that struggle is the theoretical struggle. And that's like one of, which Red Library has opened another front in, right? Mm-hmm. In that struggle.
Yeah, I think in a very meta way, what we've talked about more and more on the show is I think the real political education that we're interested in is to model a way to not collapse like disagreement or theoretical differences of opinion to like a struggle over social capital, or that like in a way, like I think constructing like genuine unity should be able to hold like antagonism and sort of disagreement, and it doesn't sort of rupture the basis of unity in the first place. And I think that kind of the way that we're trying to talk about stuff, even in this episode today, I think hopefully is demonstrating that, right? It's like, well, we can ask questions of each other and like critically think and reflect and, disagree and maybe find points of agreement. And all of that is sort of done in this sort of basis of like the relational component, which grounds all of that. I think that that's one of the most destructive things I've seen on the left, is that if you don't have that, then yeah, of course, like a small difference of ideas is going to rupture the actual basis of unity. But it's like, but that's a signal that your basis of unity is incredibly weak and brittle, not necessarily about the ideas themselves. And so hopefully that's what I want people to take away from what we do, is kind of like a modeling of how to relate to each other at the end of the day, I think.
I don't know. I think that's a great
on.
Rock and roll. Double horns in the air. Yes. Create a unity that can't be destroyed by just small petty disagreements about things. So.
Right.
Yeah,
Wouldn't that
which
be
is-
nice?
It's a
Wouldn't that
tall
be
order.
so helpful?
Yeah, it is a tall order though, but
Yeah.
yeah, to me at
It'd be
least.
really nice.
Yeah, it would be nice. But yeah, I think all the failed leftist organizing projects that I've been in, at the end of the day, were like, oh, it was we just didn't actually know how to build that base of unity to hold antagonism together. And I think that's what hopefully we can at least lay out some ideas of how to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've adopted as part of our party line for Red Library is, we come to bring the fire and the sword and division, and the idea is like, but that also means we're still in unity about it. But there is fire and the sword and division.
Yeah, we come bringing a sword, sever the people, right?
Sever the people. Yeah, that's right.
I love that.
Yeah, that was actually started as just like a dumb joke in the Discord, and then it was like, oh my god, that's actually that's what we're doing. That's our political platform. Ugh. All right, well, y'all. I mean, I don't know. I think I don't really have anything else. I mean, do you want to tag on final quotes? I mean, y'all are involved in organizing work. Do you want to touch on any ways that folks can get in touch with y'all, or if they can look up CounterPower with wherever they're at and want to get involved? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, well, first of all, we want to thank the Red Library Troika for having us on. This was awesome. And if you are interested in getting a copy of the book, Organizing for Autonomy by CounterPower, you can go to commonnotions.org. That's our publisher's website. And if you want to get in touch with us to talk about these ideas further, or to learn more about our organization, you can email us at counterpower@riseup.net. Our website is counterpower.info, and you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook at A Free Society.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. This is fun.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really
and,
good.
Maybe first of maybe others that we can do down the road. All right. Another big, huge shout out, big heart energy to CounterPower and our comrades Jaime and Padré for joining us today, having this excellent dialogue with the Red Troika Bois. And we hope that it was stimulating, engaging, refreshing, mesmerizing, enticing, and hopefully generative of some different thinking and ways to theorize what it means to organize for autonomy and freedom on today's left for yourselves out there, comrades, all across the globe. Coming up next week, we are going to have a wide release episode as well as our Patreon exclusive episode. We're going to shift things around, and during the last week of the month, when we normally would not have a wide release episode, we're still going to put one out, but we're going to focus on doing our Red Desert series for the last week of every month. So you can expect me, Comrade Adam /Chairman Bane,
I have to go mobile.
and our most excellent big brain comrade Sam to dive back into the Red Desert and our active theorizing on form and content and the impossible image and what that means. In the meantime, though, comrades, stay hydrated, stay motivated, search for ways to be emancipated, try not to be deracinated, stay strong, stay healthy, stay focused. Remember that in those moments when you feel alone and isolated, your comrades here at Red Library, and all the comrades through us across the globe, we out here. We ain't going anywhere. Stay safe, stay revolutionary. We'll see you next time. Red Library out. Peace.